I didn't call the police because I was sure. I called because I was terrified I might be right. That morning, Ethan was homesick. Just a mild fever, nothing serious. I brought him some soup and crackers, set them on his nightstand, and told him to rest. He nodded, pulled the blanket up to his chin, and closed his eyes. I stood there for a second, watching him breathe. My boy. 13 years old and still the kindest soul I'd ever known. As I turned to leave, my eyes landed on the gaming chair in the corner. Rachel had given it to him a few weeks earlier. This big, flashy thing with speakers built into the headrest and LED lights along the edges. Ethan loved it, but something about it had been nagging at me for days. A tiny feeling I couldn't explain, like a splinter under my skin that I kept pressing on without meaning to. I walked over and knelt beside it. I ran my fingers along the back cushion, and that's when I felt it. A small, hard bump beneath the fabric. My stomach dropped. I pressed harder, tracing the shape with my fingertips. It was round, flat, no bigger than a quarter. I pulled back the stitching just enough to peek inside, and there it was. A tiny glass lens, staring back at me like a dead eye. My hands started shaking. I reached deeper into the cushion and found wires, a small circuit board, a battery pack. Someone had sewn a camera into my son's chair. And not just any someone. I knew exactly who bought this chair. I knew exactly who delivered it with a smile and a hug. I stepped into the hallway, pressed my back against the wall, and dialed 911. My voice cracked when the operator picked up. 30 minutes later, when the police knocked on my door, I realized this wasn't just a mistake. It was betrayal. And the person who did it shared my last name. Hi everyone, I'm Melissa. I'm 38 years old, and I'm a registered nurse in Phoenix, Arizona. What I'm about to tell you started 6 months before I ever touched that chair. 6 months before my world split in half. But to understand what happened, you need to know where I came from. I grew up in a family where love wasn't free. It came with conditions, expectations, and an invisible scoreboard that I could never seem to win. My parents, Tom and Linda Carter, were the kind of people who measured success in titles and salaries. And by that standard, I was always falling short. My younger sister Rachel was everything they wanted. She started her first business at 25, built it into a marketing agency that pulled in 7 figures by the time she turned 30. She drove a Mercedes, lived in a gated community in Scottsdale, and posted vacation photos from places I couldn't even pronounce. Our parents treated her like royalty. Every family dinner, every holiday, every phone call, it always circled back to Rachel. What Rachel achieved, what Rachel bought, what Rachel was planning next. And me? I was just the nurse. The single mom who worked 12-hour shifts and came home smelling like hand sanitizer. I loved my job. I loved taking care of people. But in my family's eyes, that was never enough. Still, I kept showing up. I kept calling. I kept driving to their house on holidays with a casserole in one hand and my son's hand in the other. Not for me. For Ethan. He was the sweetest kid you'd ever meet. Quiet, thoughtful, always drawing or building something with his hands. He didn't have a dad in the picture. His father left when he was 3 and never looked back. So Ethan held on to whatever family he could get. He wanted grandparents who remembered his birthday. He wanted an aunt who asked about his day. He wanted to belong somewhere bigger than just the two of us. And I wanted that for him too. So I swallowed my pride over and over and kept the door open. I thought keeping them in our lives would help my son. I thought the connection would give him something I couldn't. I had no idea it would put him in danger. They showed up at my door like nothing had ever happened. No phone call, no text, no warning. Just 3 knocks on a Saturday evening while I was still in my scrubs from a double shift. I opened the door and there they were. My parents, standing on the porch with tight smiles, and behind them, Rachel, holding a massive box wrapped in shiny blue paper with a silver bow on top. For a second, I just stood there, blinking. I hadn't seen any of them in almost 4 months. The last time we spoke was at Easter, and that ended with my mother telling me I needed to stop being so sensitive after I pointed out that nobody had asked Ethan a single question during the entire meal. 4 months of silence, and now they were standing on my doorstep like a greeting card commercial. My mother stepped forward, arms wide open. She pulled me into a hug and whispered close to my ear, "We've missed you so much, sweetheart." I felt my body stiffen, but I didn't pull away. Behind her, my dad gave me a short nod and a half smile. He glanced past me into the house, scanning the living room like he was inspecting it. Then Rachel walked up, tilting her head with that apologetic look she'd perfected over the years. She touched my arm gently and said in a soft voice, "I know I've been MIA. Work has been insane. But I'm here now, and I brought something for my favorite nephew." She lifted the box slightly, shaking it just enough to make it seem exciting. Before I could respond, Ethan appeared behind me. His eyes went wide the moment he saw the box. Rachel knelt down to his level, held the box out with both hands, and said with a big smile, "Happy late birthday, buddy. I know I missed it, but I think this is gonna make up for it." Ethan looked up at me, his face lit up like a Christmas tree. I nodded, and he tore into the wrapping paper right there on the porch. When he pulled the box open and saw what was inside, he let out this sound, half gasp, half laugh. It was a gaming chair. Not just any gaming chair. The kind with built-in Bluetooth speakers, LED lighting, adjustable armrests, the works. The kind his friends at school bragged about. The kind I could never afford on a nurse's salary. Ethan threw his arms around Rachel's neck so fast he almost knocked her over. He squeezed her tight and said with pure excitement in his voice, "Oh my God, thank you so much. This is the best gift ever." Rachel hugged him back, laughing, and looked over his shoulder at me with this expression that said, "See, I'm not the villain you think I am." My mother watched the whole scene with her hands clasped together, her eyes glistening. She turned to me and said in a warm, almost rehearsed tone, "Family is family, Melissa. We need to stick together." My dad didn't say much. He just stood by the door, arms crossed, watching Ethan drag the chair inside with the kind of quiet approval that passed for affection in our family. We all moved into the living room. My mom brought a pie she'd baked, pecan, my childhood favorite. Rachel poured wine and told stories about her latest trip to Italy. My dad actually asked Ethan about school, which caught me off guard. For the first time in years, it felt almost normal, almost warm. Ethan sat on the floor next to his new chair, running his hands over the armrests, pressing every button, testing every feature. Every few minutes, he would look up at me with this grin that made my chest ache. He was so happy. Not just about the chair, about having them there. About feeling like he mattered to someone beyond just me. Later that night, after they left, I stood in Ethan's doorway and watched him set up the chair in front of his desk. He positioned it carefully, adjusted the height, plugged in the speakers, and sat down like a king, claiming his throne. He spun around once, looked at me, and said with the biggest smile I'd seen in months, "Mom, I think Aunt Rachel really does care about me." Something inside me cracked when he said that. Not broke. Just cracked. A tiny fracture I chose to ignore. That night, watching my son smile, I chose to believe them. I chose to believe that maybe people could change. That maybe my family was finally trying. I was wrong. At first, it was just a chair. But then, it became everything to him. Within the first week, Ethan had completely rearranged his bedroom around it. The chair sat in the center like a throne, facing his desk with his laptop and his old monitor he'd saved up for by mowing lawns last summer. He did everything in that chair. Homework, gaming, watching videos, eating snacks, even falling asleep with his headphones still on. I'd find him passed out at midnight, his neck bent at an angle that made me wince, the LED lights still glowing soft blue beneath him. I'd tap his shoulder and whisper to him gently, "Come on, baby. Get in, Bill." He'd mumble something, drag himself to the mattress, and be out cold again in seconds. It became routine, Every day after school, he'd walk straight to his room, drop his backpack on the floor, and sink into that chair like the rest of the world didn't exist. At first, I thought it was just a phase, a new toy, a new obsession. Kids his age get attached to things. I told myself it was normal, but after a few weeks, I started noticing small changes. Little things that didn't seem like much on their own, but added up in ways I couldn't quite name. He started closing his door more often. Before the chair, he'd leave it wide open while he played games or did homework. Now it was shut almost every time. I'd knock, and he'd take a beat too long to answer, like he was adjusting something before letting me in. One evening, I knocked and opened the door at the same time. Ethan flinched. Not a big dramatic flinch, just a quick snap of his shoulders, like I'd startled him. He turned around in the chair and looked at me with a nervous grin. I stood in the doorway holding a plate of apple slices and asked him casually, "Hey, everything okay in here?" He nodded quickly, took the plate, and said without meeting my eyes, "Yeah, I'm fine, just doing homework." I glanced at his screen. It was open to a YouTube video, not homework. But I didn't push it. He was 13. 13-year-olds lie about homework. That's what I told myself. Another thing I noticed was the way he positioned the chair. It always faced the desk, but he'd angled it so his back was to the door. Every single time. If I moved it while vacuuming, he'd move it right back. One Saturday morning, I shifted the chair a few inches to clean behind the desk. When Ethan came back from the kitchen, he stopped in the doorway, stared at the chair for a second, then walked over and pushed it back into its exact spot. He looked over his shoulder at me and said with a quick, almost defensive tone, "I like it this way, Mom. Please don't move it." I raised my hands in surrender, laughed it off, and said lightly, Okay, your room, your rules." But something about the way he said it stayed with me. It wasn't just preference. It felt like protection. Like he was guarding something. Then there were the headphones. Ethan had always liked music, but now the headphones were permanently attached to his head. He wore them during meals, during car rides, even walking from his room to the bathroom. When I asked him what he was listening to, he'd shrug and mumble the same answer every time with a flat, almost rehearsed voice. "Just music, Mom. Nothing weird." I wanted to believe him. I really did. And for a while, I managed to convince myself that everything was fine. He was just growing up. Boys his age pull away. They get private. They stop wanting to hang out with their moms. That's what every parenting article told me. That's what my coworker Sandra said when I mentioned it during a break at the hospital. She leaned against the counter with her coffee and told me matter-of-factly, "Girl, my son locked himself in his room for 2 years straight. It's just puberty. Don't overthink it." So I didn't. I let it go. I told myself I was being paranoid, that I was projecting my own anxiety onto my kid. I told myself that Ethan was fine, that the chair was just a chair, and that my family's visit was a genuine attempt at reconciliation. I ignored the signs, every single one of them, until the day I couldn't anymore. It wasn't obvious. It was worse. It was hidden perfectly. The morning I found it, Ethan was homesick with a low fever. Nothing serious, just enough to keep him out of school. I'd called in late to work, made him soup, and set him up in bed with his tablet and a bottle of Gatorade. He fell asleep around 10, and I figured I'd use the quiet time to tidy up his room a little. Clothes on the floor, empty chip bags on the desk, the usual mess of a teenage boy. I started with the desk, wiping it down, stacking his notebooks, tossing out dried-up pens. Then I moved to the chair. I grabbed the small vacuum attachment and ran it along the seat cushion, picking up crumbs and lint. As I worked my way around the back of the chair, my hand brushed against something that didn't belong. A small, hard bump underneath the fabric near the top of the backrest. I stopped, pressed my fingers against it. It was round, flat, maybe the size of a quarter. At first, I thought it was a button or some kind of structural piece, part of the chair's design. But when I pushed on it, it didn't move like something that was built in. It felt separate, like it had been placed there. My pulse picked up, but I told myself to calm down. I ran my fingers along the seam and found a spot where the stitching was slightly different. Not torn, not messy, just newer than the rest. Like someone had opened it up and sewed it back together carefully. Very carefully. I grabbed a pair of small scissors from Ethan's desk and carefully cut along the seam, just enough to see inside. I pulled back the fabric and felt my breath catch in my throat. There was a small glass lens, no bigger than a pencil eraser, embedded in the cushion and aimed outward. It was pointed directly at the area in front of the chair, directly at the desk, directly at where my son sat every single day. My hands started trembling. I reached deeper into the cushion, my fingers moving through the foam padding, and found wires. Thin, flexible wires running down the inside of the backrest, connected to a flat circuit board no bigger than a credit card. Next to it was a battery pack, slim and compact, the kind you'd find inside a wireless device. And tucked against the bottom frame, wrapped in black tape, was a tiny microphone. My whole body went cold. I pulled my hands out and just stared at the chair. My mind was racing, but my body couldn't move. A camera, a microphone. Inside my son's chair. Inside the chair that sat in his bedroom, the most private space he had. The chair where he changed clothes after a shower. The chair where he sat in his underwear on hot nights. The chair where he lived his most unguarded, most vulnerable moments. I felt sick. Not the kind of sick where you feel it in your stomach. The kind that starts in your chest and radiates outward, filling every part of you with something dark and heavy. I stepped back from the chair like it was a living thing, like it might reach out and grab me. My mind started connecting the pieces faster than I wanted it to. The way Ethan always kept his back to the door. The way he flinched when I walked in. The headphones he never took off. Had he known? Had he sensed something was wrong without understanding what it was? Or was it worse than that? Had someone been watching him this whole time? I pressed my back against the wall and slid down to the floor. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold my phone. I kept thinking about Rachel standing on my porch with that box, the blue wrapping paper, the silver bow, the way she knelt down and handed it to Ethan with that warm smile. The way she hugged him and said it was a late birthday gift. A gift. She called it a gift. I thought about my parents standing behind her, nodding, smiling, playing their parts. I thought about my mother saying family is family. I thought about Ethan's face when he opened that box. The pure joy, the gratitude, the way he threw his arms around Rachel like she was the best aunt in the world. And now I was sitting on his bedroom floor, staring at a camera hidden inside the thing she gave him. A camera pointed at my child. I wanted to scream. I wanted to drive to Rachel's house and tear her door off the hinges. I wanted to call my parents and unleash every ounce of rage that was building inside me like a pressure valve about to blow. But I didn't. Not yet. I stood up, walked into the hallway, and closed Ethan's door quietly behind me. He was still sleeping in my bedroom, his chest rising and falling slowly, completely unaware. I leaned against the hallway wall, pressed my phone to my chest, and took 3 deep breaths. Then I dialed 911. When the operator picked up, my voice cracked. I told her someone had put a camera in my son's bedroom. She asked me to stay calm. She asked if my son was safe. She asked if I knew who might have done this. I paused, my jaw tightened, and then I said the words that would change everything. I said her name. 30 minutes later, when the police knocked on my door, I opened it with steady hands and dry eyes. The shaking had stopped. The tears had dried. What replaced them was something colder, something sharper. And in that moment, standing in the doorway of my own home, I knew exactly who gave my son that chair. And I knew exactly what I was going to do about it. I was praying I was wrong. I was standing in the living room, arms crossed tight against my chest, watching 2 officers move through my son's bedroom like it was a crime scene. Because it was. Officer Daniels, a tall woman with short brown hair and a calm voice, was the first to examine the chair. She pulled on a pair of blue latex gloves, knelt beside it, and carefully opened the seam I had already cut. She didn't react at first. She just looked. Then she called her partner over. Officer Ruiz walked over, leaned in, and let out a slow breath through his nose. He looked at Daniels, then back at me. Neither of them said anything for a moment. That silence told me everything. Daniels stood up, peeled off one glove, and turned to face me. She spoke in a measured, professional tone. "Ma'am, there is a small camera and a microphone embedded inside this chair. The device appears to be wireless and capable of transmitting a live signal." I heard every word she said, but my brain refused to process them. I just stood there, nodding, like she was giving me directions to a grocery store. Ruiz was already on his radio, calling for a forensic tech. He stepped out of the room and I could hear him in the hallway, his voice low but urgent. Daniels stayed with me. She asked if she could sit down with me in the living room, and I followed her like a ghost. We sat on the couch, the same couch where Rachel had poured wine and told stories about Italy just weeks ago. Daniels pulled out a small notebook and clicked her pen. She looked at me with steady eyes and asked in a careful but direct voice, "Do you have any idea who may have placed this device in the chair?" I swallowed hard. My throat felt like sandpaper. I knew the answer. I'd known it since the moment I found that lens staring back at me from inside the cushion. But saying it out loud meant making it real. I looked down at my hands, took a breath, and said quietly, "My sister, Rachel Carter. She gave the chair to my son about a month ago." Daniels didn't flinch. She wrote the name down and asked me to spell it. Then she asked, when the chair was delivered, who was present, and whether Rachel had been alone with Ethan at any point since. I answered every question, my voice flat, my eyes fixed on the carpet. Each answer felt like pulling a thread from a sweater, and the whole thing was unraveling fast. The forensic tech arrived about an hour later. A quiet man with wire-rimmed glasses who introduced himself as Gary. He spent nearly 40 minutes taking the chair apart piece by piece. When he finished, he laid everything out on a plastic sheet on the floor. The camera, the microphone, the circuit board, the battery, the wires, all of it. He looked up at Daniels and explained in a technical but clear voice, "This is a custom-installed surveillance setup. The camera has a wide-angle lens, decent resolution, and the signal is Bluetooth paired, likely to a nearby device or relay. The mic is omnidirectional. Based on the battery size, this could run for days between charges, or it could be hardwired to the chair's own power source through the USB port." I felt my knees go weak. Days. It had been in Ethan's room for weeks. Daniels asked me one more question before they left. She looked at me with a gaze that was part professional, part human, and asked gently, "Is there anything else you want to tell us, Melissa? Anything at all?" I shook my head. She handed me her card and told me a detective would be in touch within 24 hours. She told me not to contact Rachel. She told me to let the investigation run its course. She told me to keep Ethan away from the chair and to try to stay calm. I walked them to the door. I thanked them. I closed the door behind them. I stood in the hallway, alone, the house completely silent except for the sound of Ethan's breathing coming from my bedroom. Daniels told me not to contact Rachel. She told me to wait. She told me to let the system handle it. I stood there for maybe 5 minutes, staring at the front door, feeling every muscle in my body coil tighter and tighter, and then I grabbed my car keys. I didn't wait for justice. I didn't wait for detectives or warrants or official phone calls. I got in my car, backed out of the driveway, and drove straight to Rachel's house. It was the worst decision I made that day. But I couldn't stop myself. I didn't wait for justice. I drove straight to her house. The drive from my place to Rachel's took about 25 minutes. I don't remember most of it. I don't remember the traffic lights, or the turns, or the radio playing. All I remember is my hands gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white, and this sound in my ears like rushing water, like my own blood was screaming at me to keep going. Rachel lived in one of those gated communities in Scottsdale where every house looked like it belonged in a magazine. Perfect lawns, perfect driveways, perfect everything. I pulled up to the gate, punched in the visitor code she'd given me years ago, and drove through. Her house was at the end of a cul-de-sac. White stucco walls, terracotta roof, a front yard full of desert landscaping with those expensive rocks and succulents that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget. I parked crooked, half on the driveway, half on the street. I didn't care. I walked up to the front door and rang the bell. Then I knocked. Then I rang it again. The door opened, and there she was. Rachel, standing in her silk robe, hair pulled back in a messy bun, holding a glass of white wine at 4 in the afternoon. She looked at me with mild surprise, the kind of expression you'd give a neighbor who showed up without calling first. She tilted her head slightly and said in a casual, almost amused voice, "Melissa, what are you doing here?" I didn't answer. I pushed past her into the foyer. She stumbled back a step, wine sloshing over the rim of her glass. I spun around and faced her. My chest was heaving, my eyes were burning. Every word I'd rehearsed in the car vanished. All that was left was raw, unfiltered rage. I stepped closer and said through clenched teeth, "What did you put in that chair, Rachel?" Her face shifted. Not guilt, not surprise, something else. Something controlled. She set her wine glass down on the entryway table, slow and deliberate, and crossed her arms. She looked at me the way she always looked at me, like I was a child throwing a tantrum over nothing. She let out a small sigh and said in a patronizing tone, "What are you talking about?" I felt my whole body vibrate. I took another step toward her and said louder, "The camera, Rachel. The camera inside the chair you gave my son. The one pointed at his desk. The one recording him in his bedroom. What did you do?" For a split second, something flickered behind her eyes. A flash of something real, but she buried it fast. She uncrossed her arms, held up both hands like she was calming a scared animal, and said in a smooth, measured voice, "Okay, you need to calm down. I have no idea what you're talking about. I bought that chair online. If something was in it, it came from the manufacturer." I laughed. Not because it was funny, because the lie was so clean, so rehearsed, so perfectly delivered that it made me want to break something. I shook my head and said with my voice cracking, "Don't do that. Don't stand there and gaslight me. The police already pulled it apart. They found the camera, the mic, the wiring. Someone installed that after the chair was made. Someone who had access to it before it was wrapped in blue paper and delivered to my front door." Rachel didn't blink. She took a step back, put one hand on her hip, and tilted her head again. Her voice dropped lower, almost gentle, almost concerned, and she said carefully, "Melissa, I think you're having some kind of episode. You've always been like this. You see things that aren't there. You twist everything into some kind of conspiracy. Maybe you should talk to someone." That was it. That was the line. I snapped. I grabbed her by the collar of her robe and shoved her backward. She hit the hallway wall with a thud, her eyes going wide for the first time. I was inches from her face, my hand still gripping the silk, my breath coming out in sharp, ragged bursts. I said in a low voice that didn't even sound like mine, "If you ever come near my son again, I will end you. Do you understand me?" She didn't scream. She didn't cry. She just stared at me with those cold, calculating eyes and said nothing. And that's when it hit me. She wasn't scared. Not even a little. She was waiting. Waiting for me to do exactly what I was doing. Waiting for me to lose control so she could use it against me. Outside, I heard a door close. A neighbor had come out onto their porch, probably drawn by the noise. I released Rachel's robe and stepped back. My hands were trembling. She straightened her collar, picked up her wine glass, and took a sip. She looked at me over the rim and said in a voice so calm it made my skin crawl, "You should leave before you do something you'll regret, Melissa." I stood there, chest heaving, fists clenched, every nerve in my body on fire. And then I turned around and walked out. I got in my car, closed the door, and sat in her driveway for a full minute, staring at nothing. That was the moment I realized she wasn't scared because she had a plan. She'd had one all along, and I had just walked right into it. They came back, not to apologize, to negotiate. It was almost 11 at night when I heard the knock. Ethan was already asleep in my room. I'd moved him there after the police left, told him his bedroom needed to be cleaned and reorganized. He didn't ask questions. He just grabbed his pillow and his tablet and curled up on my bed like a little kid again. I was sitting at the kitchen table, staring at my phone, waiting for the detective to call, when 3 sharp knocks hit the front door. I didn't move at first. Then I heard my mother's voice, muffled through the wood, tight and urgent. She said in a strained whisper, "Melissa, open the door. We need to talk." I stood up slowly. My body felt heavy, like every muscle was filled with sand. I walked to the door and opened it. All 3 of them were standing there. My mother in front, clutching her purse with both hands. My father behind her, hands in his jacket pockets, jaw set hard. And Rachel, standing slightly off to the side, arms crossed, chin up, looking at me like I was the one who owed her something. Nobody smiled. Nobody hugged. My mother stepped inside without waiting to be invited. My father followed. Rachel walked in last, closing the door behind her like she owned the place. We stood in the living room, all 4 of us, and for a few seconds, nobody said a word. The silence was thick enough to choke on. My mother was the first to speak. She sat down on the edge of the armchair, set her purse on her lap, and looked at me with that expression she always used when she wanted me to fall in line. Disappointed but patient, like I was a child who had broken a vase and needed to be talked through the consequences. She folded her hands together and said in a firm, controlled voice, "Melissa, we know what happened today. Rachel told us. And we're here because this needs to stop before it goes any further." I felt my jaw tighten. I looked at Rachel. She was leaning against the wall near the hallway, arms still crossed, face blank. Not nervous, not guilty, just waiting. I turned back to my mother and said flatly, "What exactly did Rachel tell you?" My father stepped forward before my mother could answer. He pulled his hands out of his pockets and held them up like a referee. He spoke in that deep, authoritative voice he always used when he wanted to end a conversation before it started. "It doesn't matter what she said. What matters is that you went to her house, put your hands on her, and threatened her. That's assault, Melissa. You understand that?" I almost laughed. My sister hid a camera in my son's bedroom, and my father was standing in my living room lecturing me about assault. I looked at him and said slowly, "She put a camera in Ethan's room, Dad. A camera and a microphone. In his bedroom. The police confirmed it." My father's face didn't change. Not a flicker of shock. Not a hint of outrage. He just exhaled through his nose and glanced at Rachel. That glance told me everything. He already knew. They all already knew. My mother cleared her throat and shifted in her seat. She leaned forward and said in a softer tone, the one she used when she was about to offer a deal, "Melissa, honey, we understand you're upset. But there's a reasonable explanation for all of this." Rachel was worried about Ethan. She thought he might be getting into trouble online, and she wanted to keep an eye on him. It was misguided. Yes, but it came from a place of love. I stared at my mother. The words hit me like ice water. A place of love. A hidden camera in a 13-year-old boy's bedroom, and my mother was calling it love. Rachel finally pushed off the wall and took a step toward me. She uncrossed her arms and held out her hands, palms up, like she was offering peace. She spoke in a measured, almost rehearsed voice. "Look, I know it looks bad. I should have told you. That's on me. But I swear, it was just to make sure he was safe. I never recorded anything inappropriate. I'll give you my word on that." I didn't blink. I didn't move. I just let her talk. My father reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded check. He held it out toward me and said in a low voice, "We want to make this right, Melissa. Rachel is willing to cover any costs, therapy for Ethan, whatever you need, and we'll add to it $50,000 for your trouble, but you need to drop this." No police, no charges, no courts. We handle this as a family. $50,000. That was the price they put on my son. I looked at the check in my father's hand. Then I looked at my mother, sitting with her hands folded like she was at church. Then I looked at Rachel, standing there with her rehearsed apology and her clean conscience. Something shifted inside me. Not rage, not grief, something quieter, something patient. I took a breath and said calmly, 50,000 isn't enough. The room went still. My father blinked. My mother's lips parted slightly. Rachel's eyes narrowed. I continued, keeping my voice steady. If you want this to go away, it's going to cost more than that. A lot more. I want 200,000 in writing. And I want a signed statement from Rachel admitting what she did. My father looked at Rachel. Rachel looked at my mother. My mother looked at me. None of them noticed the small red light blinking on the shelf behind me. The nanny cam I'd bought 3 years ago when Ethan was home alone after school. The one I'd turned on 5 minutes before I opened the front door. They thought they were buying my silence. But they had just given me everything I needed. In court, truth doesn't shout. It proves itself. Rachel's lawyers came prepared. They argued the camera had been part of a factory defect, that Rachel had no technical knowledge to install such a device, that Melissa was an emotionally unstable single mother with a history of family conflict. They filed motions to dismiss. They attacked my character. They painted me as jealous, paranoid, and vindictive. And for a while, it almost worked. The forensic team had recovered the camera and the microphone from the chair, but Rachel had been smart. She'd wiped her phone, reset her cloud storage, and deleted every trace of whatever data the camera had transmitted. There were no saved recordings, no footage, no digital trail connecting her to the device. The prosecution's case was hanging by a thread. Then my lawyer played the video, the nanny cam footage from that night in my living room. Clear audio, clear picture. My father holding out a check. My mother explaining it away as love. Rachel offering her carefully worded confession. And all three of them negotiating a price to make it disappear. The courtroom went silent. Rachel's lawyer asked for a recess. Rachel's face turned white. My parents wouldn't look at me. The judge reviewed the footage, ruled it admissible, and the trial moved forward. Rachel was charged with unlawful surveillance of a minor and invasion of privacy. She pleaded no contest after her lawyers told her the video made a jury trial unwinnable. She was sentenced to 3 years of probation, mandatory counseling, a permanent restraining order, and registration on a watch list. My parents were named as co-conspirators in the cover-up attempt. They weren't criminally charged, but the judge's remarks made it clear they had enabled and protected Rachel at the expense of their own grandson. Justice was served, but it didn't feel like a victory. It felt like a funeral for the family I once wished I had. A year has passed since that day, and everything has changed. Ethan and I moved to Seattle 3 months after the trial. I found a nursing position at a hospital near the waterfront, and we rented a small apartment on the 3rd floor of an old brick building with a view of the Puget Sound. It wasn't much, but it was ours. No ghosts. No memories hiding in the corners. No chairs with secrets sewn into them. The first few months were rough. Ethan barely talked. He'd sit by the window for hours, staring at the water, his headphones on, his face blank. I signed him up for therapy twice a week. At first he resisted, told me he didn't need it, that he was fine. But after a few sessions, something started to shift. He came home one afternoon, dropped his backpack on the kitchen counter, and looked at me with red-rimmed eyes. He stood there for a moment, then said in a quiet, shaky voice, "Mom, it wasn't my fault, right? What Aunt Rachel did, it wasn't because of something I did?" I crossed the kitchen in 2 steps and pulled him into me so hard I thought I'd crush him. I held his face in my hands and said with everything I had, "Listen to me. None of this was your fault. Not one single second of it. You did nothing wrong. Do you hear me? Nothing." He nodded. And then he cried. Really cried, for the first time since it all started. We stood there in the kitchen for a long time, holding on to each other while the sun went down over the water. That was the day I knew we were going to be okay. Not perfect, not fixed, but okay. I still think about my parents sometimes. I wonder if they ever sit at that big dining table and notice the two empty chairs. I wonder if my mother still says family is family when there's no one left to say it to. I wonder if Rachel ever thinks about what she did, or if she's already found a way to convince herself it wasn't that bad. But I don't call. I don't text. I don't drive back. Some doors need to stay closed to keep the people inside safe. Ethan is 14 now. He joined the art club at his new school. He's drawing again, filling sketchbooks with landscapes and superheroes and weird little creatures he invents. Last week, he showed me a drawing of our apartment, the brick walls, the big window, the two of us sitting on the couch watching a movie. He pointed at it and said with a small, proud smile, "That's home, Mom." I looked at that drawing and felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Not happiness exactly. Something deeper. Something quieter. Peace. So here's my question to you. If you were me, if your own family did this to your child, would you ever let them back in? Would you ever let your son sit across from them at a dinner table again? I've made my choice, but I want to hear yours. Comment below and tell me what you would do. Because the truth is, some betrayals don't come from strangers. They come from the people who were supposed to love you the most. And that's the kind of wound that never fully heals.